Okay, I am Chris Avina with American Outdoor News, and today we're here with Taylor Schmits from the Congressional Sportsmen Foundation. Taylor, thanks so much for coming on today.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Appreciate you having us on.
Now, can you tell us a little bit about what the Congressional Sportsmen Foundation actually does for us? I'm
Sure.
aware, and I know a lot of my people are aware, but I don't think the general public really knows just how much you do for us.
Yeah, sure. Happy to, Chris. So the Congressional Sportsmen Foundation was established in 1989 to work with the bipartisan bicameral Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus. CSF is not a member-based organization like most of our partners in this space. We also don't do any on-the-ground habitat work, which is really different than most of the other organizations in our space. CSF is purely a policy organization. We don't get into any political fights. We're a nonpartisan organization that focuses solely on all issues is important related to hunting, fishing, trapping, and recreational shooting policies across the country. So we work with the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus here in DC. In my day-to-day job, I'm the Director of Federal Relations for CSF. So I spend my time working the Capitol, working with the presidential administration on issues related to hunting, fishing, trapping, and recreational shooting. But then we also have a state policy team who represents hunters and anglers across the country in all 50 states. And the way that they do that is they have a network of state legislative sportsmen's caucuses. So in each state legislature, similar to the Congressional Sportsmen's Caucus in DC, there are state legislative sportsmen's caucuses that work on issues of importance to our community. Where CSF really fits in there, we serve as a liaison to all of those caucuses at the federal and state level on all issues of importance to our community. As I said, we're not a member-based group. We don't put money on the ground for habitat or access work, but we help facilitate those policies and make sure that those programs can be in place for our partners and sportsmen and women across the country. So that's kind of where we fit in.
Well, earlier this year, the Biden administration put in the bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which kind of slid by us that it would cut the federal funding for hunter education, outdoor wilderness classes, archery in schools, things of that nature, that would really affect outdoorsmen in general. Now, it didn't take you guys long to really jump on things and try and turn things around.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. So in June 2022, Congress passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And included in this bill was language that prohibited training school personnel in the use of a dangerous weapon. And I'm not an attorney, but obviously words matter, right? Especially when you're talking about legislation where it's extremely nuanced and each word in a bill matters. So the issue here is when Congress passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, they amended the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which provides about roughly $18 to $20 billion for various school programs across the country. Every single state receives this money, but they included that prohibition on dangerous weapon. And the challenge is that a dangerous weapon is defined in U.S. code as a weapon, device, instrument, material, or substance, animate or inanimate, that is used for or readily capable of causing death or serious bodily injury, except that term does not provide to a pocket knife with a blade of less than 2.5 inches. So when you take that plain language, it applies to everything, right? Not just the issues that we're focused on at CSF, like you mentioned, as archery in schools, wilderness courses, school-sponsored shooting teams, etc. But it can even be applied to Bunsen burners in the classroom, or culinary classes, or culinary knives in home ec, right? So this is a serious issue, and that's really kind of the quick overview of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act and its impacts on our community, but happy to dive into it further.
So I think what it really comes down to, as far as Congress putting through bills, they really have to scrutinize word for word what these bills are actually stating or what they're trying to sneak in there without us seeing. or realizing until it's passed, or things like this. And we saw this in New York when the governor put through one of her new gun bills. Actually, I think this was under Como, with the magazine restrictions, where police officers would actually be breaking the law because their magazines were a lot more than were stated in the law. So in essence, you guys, the Congressional Sportsmen Foundation, actually helped facilitate the HR 5110, which was the Hunting, Heritage, and Education Act. Now,
yeah, that's go ahead, Chris.
How did you catch what was in there, and how did you help facilitate the Hunting, Heritage, and Education Act?
Yeah, so before going into the Protecting Hunting Heritage and Education Act, I'll provide I think you made an important point there, right? There's the legislative intent, right? And then there's the unintended consequences of legislation. And to your point, right, when you're drafting bills, you have to sit down and really think about what each word's going to do in reality and how that's going to be implemented, right? The Congress has their intent, and then sometimes words can be misconstrued, or sometimes the language is so clear that the people implementing the language within the administration at both the state and federal levels are largely limited in what they can do in terms of, twisting the words a little bit. So that was really the issue with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Is the legislative intent was to prohibit training for school resource officers and security personnel. It was not to impact the programs that we're interested in at CSF. But again, the unfortunate reality is that words do matter, and sometimes when the language isn't tight enough or specific enough, there are unintended consequences, and that was the case here.
Collateral damage.
Exactly. Our position at CSF, and I strongly believe this is not a nefarious attempt or any effort to undermine these programs across the country, but it's just the reality of the language. So with that in mind, Congress did step in extremely quickly. We first heard about this really coming to a head in Alaska, where the state education recreation coordinator had heard from some folks at the U.S. Department of Education that Elementary and Secondary Education Act funds were no longer available for wilderness course. And then we started to see that trickle down to other states for archery in schools, hunter education, school-sponsored shooting teams, any program that utilizes what's technically a dangerous weapon, right?
Sure.
So Congress stepped in. Once Congress got word of this, they stepped in. The first bill out there was known as Protecting Hunting Heritage and Education Act, as you mentioned, which was led by Congressional Sportsmen Caucus members Mark Green out of Tennessee and Congressman Richard Hudson out of North Carolina. They were the first ones to jump on this. That said, I think everybody across the gamut recognized the trouble with banning federal funds for these programs, right? So you really saw a very coordinated, very proactive response from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle, right? The beauty of these issues is it doesn't matter whether you're a Republican, Democrat, Green Party, Tea Party, you're out there because you love hunting, fishing, you love recreational shooting and trapping, right?
Yep.
So we saw a very quick response to this, and Congressman Green introduced his bill in early August. Congress was on recess at that point, but as soon as the House was back, the very first week in September, the week of September 13th, they took this bill up at the committee level, right? And as everybody knows, bill has to go through committee first, and then it can be brought to the floor for further consideration. So they passed this bill at the committee level unanimously. And then the following week in the House, they passed this bill 424 to 1. At a time when Congress is as divided as it is, passing legislation with a margin that wide is largely unheard of, right?
Sure, it's a landslide.
It is. So then a week later, or actually, I'm lying, a day later, the Senate took up the Protecting Hunting Heritage and Education Act, and they quickly expedited this process through a procedural motion. I won't get into that because it's pretty nuanced, but as we know, the Senate is a very, very slow moving body. But again, recognizing, the value of these programs for sportsmen and women across the country, millions and millions of students across the country in terms of building camaraderie, teaching responsibility and life lessons. The Senate stepped in quickly and expedited the process to move this bill. And less than 24 hours after the House passed this bill, the Senate passed it unanimously.
That's really fast in this climate.
It's incredibly fast. I mean, the fact that it took less than really 2 months for this bill to be drafted, introduced, and pass both chambers of Congress with the current dynamics in Congress right now is really unheard of.
It's unprecedented. You don't see that.
It is. That's exactly right. So where the bill's at now, we're currently waiting for the bill has officially been sent to President Biden for signature. We have heard that he intends to sign this. Again, I think, at the department or at the White House and the Department of Education, they recognize the value of these programs and
Sure.
they want to fully support them. So that's where we're at generally right now.
Well, I mean, it's good to know that we have organizations such as yours that keep us not only informed, you influence on our behalf, and you defend our traditions, which, the average sportsman, I think, takes for granted.
Yeah, I think so, Chris. And I think, we have such a rich history of, hunting, fishing, and other outdoor activities in our country. And I think we as a community do take those opportunities for granted sometimes, right? And we're seeing things across the country at both the federal and state level. Frankly, they're just attacks on our community. And I think you're starting to see more coordination from our community, which is really, really encouraging to see. And, where CSF kind of fits into this is politics is not always an attractive game, right? It can be messy. It's a lot of personalities that you're dealing with. But at the end of the day, for us to go out and do the things that we love, we have to make sure that the policies are in place to help facilitate those opportunities. I love my job, right? I'm very fortunate to work on hunting and fishing policy every single day. But if you're asking me if I'd rather be working on policy or actually be hunting and fishing, I can tell you which one I'm going to go to, right?
You and me both.
That's exactly right. So,
well, I know that this administration says they champion for the outdoors and protecting the environment, but it isn't always in the sportsman's best interests. There's lead bans going on right now that don't only hurt hunters, as fishermen as well. You can't use lead sinkers. You can't use lead shot, lead bullets, which adds to cost. There's other restrictions going on, as you know. Is there anything that we should know as far as what your Congressional Sportsmen is working on?
I would say the biggest thing that we're working on, Chris, and this is, just a general comment, is just working on not only maintaining access for our community, but promoting access and enhancing access, right? It's easy for us to, be happy with what we have, but we also need to make sure that we're facilitating additional opportunities, right? And access can be often a difficult term to define, right? Is access, being able to drive your truck right up to the Forest Service unit, or is it, having a park at the Forest Service gate and walk 2 miles back? What is defined as access? But I would say, the administration, certainly, we are working with them every single day on all of the issues that you mentioned. One thing that I do think is important to give credit to the Biden-Harris administration is that they're always willing to have those tough conversations with us. We recognize that there are certain areas that we have to agree to disagree, right? Yep. But let's not let that impact the 95% of other things that we do agree on. And it is encouraging to see that, right? We have very good relations with the folks in the Biden-Harris administration, and that's just the nature of CSF being a nonpartisan organization, right? And these issues really being nonpartisan. But again, we recognize that the administration has challenges
Mhm.
coming from the other side of the spectrum, but again, their willingness to have those tough conversations with us in an honest and open manner really does go a long way. And again, we know we're not going to agree on everything, right?
Of course not.
It doesn't matter who's in office; we're not going to agree on everything, right? But the willingness to have those tough conversations is what's important at the end of the day. And the administration's willingness to speak with a diverse group of stakeholders from our community, whether it's NGOs like CSF or some of our partners that do put the money on the ground, or even talking on the lead stuff, right, where they're having conversations with those businesses that are manufacturing lead ammunition, those businesses that are manufacturing lead tackle, and really hearing from those businesses about how some of these phase outs that will be effective in 2026 will actually not only impact sportsmen and women, but impact those that are actually manufacturing these products, right?
Sure. And the
It's
impact on the economy as well.
That's exactly right. And the economy, but also the challenges with just switching to non-lead products, right? There are certain things you mentioned, fishing sinkers, right? There are certain metal materials that simply do not work for fishing sinkers, right?
Yeah,
Lead is by and far not only most cost effective, but it's also the most effective material in and of itself, right?
sure.
So it's, we're working on those issues every single day. But again, it is encouraging to see the administration at least willing to have those conversations with us.
That's a major step. That's if they're not willing to talk, then we're not getting anywhere. The fight is a lot harder.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the administration does support our community. They do recognize the value of these programs and activities, not just for recreation, but also for conservation. Right? It's
Sure.
obviously not lost on you that sportsmen and women are the greatest conservationists in the country, and we not only talk the talk, but we walk the walk and put our money where our mouth is. Right?
Yep.
So they do recognize that, and I think there are opportunities to advance our interests within the current administration, and recognizing that we do have some challenges that we do have to work through.
No, I think one of the biggest challenges that we come across is that the average sportsman is not as informed as they should be to the issues that are going to affect their long-term lifestyle. How do we keep them informed, and how do we engage them to be more active in helping facilitate the preservation of our traditions?
Yeah, I think the simple thing is, Chris, is to follow your conservation partners, right? Everybody in our community is a member of at least one conservation organization, right?
Sure.
Whether you're a duck hunter and you love, California waterfowl, or Ducks Unlimited, or Delta waterfowl, or turkey hunter with Turkey Federation, right? Subscribe to those organizations. Subscribe to the Congressional Sportsmen Foundation weekly newsletter, right? It's free for us. And that contains all of the information that's going around across the country. And it's broken down in a manner that makes it clear how this actually impacts you. So the simple answer is get engaged with your NGO partners. They are working, our partners range from anybody from freshwater fishing to saltwater fishing, direct shooting to turkey hunting, big game hunting, et cetera, right? So,
Hmm.
but we're all working together in a collaborative manner to address these issues, and we're all putting out a lot of information about what's going on. So the simple answer is just get engaged with those folks. As we talked about, policy and politics is a nuanced thing, right? But it does have real life implications for our community.
Yeah.
And, sometimes it requires thinking through this, right? When you look at an example, I'm a resident of Maryland, lifelong resident of Maryland, still hunt and fish in Maryland, 70 plus days a year. We just went through a pretty significant, I won't say significant, but significant enough license fee increase in the state, right? And that was the first time we've had a license fee increase in the state of Maryland in 30 years. And I, heard a lot and saw a lot of opposition to that license fee increase, right? But I think it's because folks don't recognize that they believe it's more bloating of bureaucracy at the state agency level, and it's not money actually going on the ground to help the things that we love and care about and the things that we cherish, right? So it's also, staying up to date on with our conservation partners, but really thinking through, okay, how is this going to help the things that I love, or how is this going to hurt the things that I love?
Well, everybody really has to do their part because there's a lot going on today. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm on the board of directors for the Northeast chapter of Dallas Safari Club, and we've always been a big supporter of Congressional Sportsmen's Foundation, but I think we have to be more vocal as a chapter as well, and get out and inform and keep our members aware of what's going on. It's not always about writing a check and letting the other guy do it. It's about getting your own feet wet and rolling up your sleeves and doing it yourself as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And you're absolutely right. Dallas Safari Club has been one of CSF's best partners over the last 3 decades. Dallas Safari Club President and CEO Corey Mason is actually a board member of CSF, and is a fantastic board member for us, and is really a true leader in our space. And that partnership is certainly not lost on us. But to your point, right, we have to make sure that our voices are heard, but we also have to be effectively communicating this information to the general public, right? You and I both know that hunters represent less than 5% of the population.
Yep.
And by and large, hunting is widely accepted across the country, but we're starting to see that acceptance rate decline. And that's because we as sportsmen and women are not communicating the benefits and the value of these programs as effectively as we should. And, hunting activities is not going to be lost overnight, right? It's going to slowly be lost because public opinion and public perception of these programs and activities has changed, right? And we need to be doing everything we can to talk about the value of these activities.
Well, it's the long game. You take a little before you know it. You're losing the use of a public land, or the right to use certain products or certain metals, things of that nature. We just have to be more aware and more proactive.
Yep, that's exactly right. And proactive is key, right? What we've seen from, for lack of a better term, the animal rights organizations that are working every single day to undermine the things that we care about, they're proactive. The reality is they're well funded. They have a lot of staff, a lot of attorneys that fight these things every single day. And you have groups like CSF and Dallas Safari Club and others that are working to fight back. And we need to keep being proactive as a community to make sure that these efforts from the animal rights groups are not undermining any of the success that we've had over the last century or so.
That actually brings up a really good point. What exactly do these animal rights groups do to help conservation or the preservation of a specific species? Or what do they actually do? Do they put money into these programs, or do they just put their money into hate campaigns?
Yeah, a lot of it is, they tie up a lot of conservation money and a lot of resources through litigation, right? The reality is lawsuits take a lot of time and a lot of money. And, there's a couple of ways that the animal rights group try to undermine our community. And one of them primarily is through litigation. But the other effort that we're seeing right now is ballot box biology, right? Where you're putting an initiative before, the general public at X state and saying, how do you feel about this? Let's go vote on it. We saw this in 2022 in Oregon with IP13 that sought to ban all hunting, fishing, and livestock slaughter. I mean, the question is that I have for folks is, how do they expect us to eat, right? If we can't hunt, we can't fish, we can't raise livestock. The reality is we don't have the space in this country for everybody to eat, potatoes and asparagus. As much as I love that, we can't
I'm not equipped to be a vegan.
Right, exactly. So, I would say they really prey on emotion, right? You and I both know that hunting is an emotional thing, right? It is not easy to take the life of a deer or a turkey or a fish even, but they really prey on that individual emotion, right? Not the facts and the value of these programs. And they just conveniently ignore the value of these activities, right? They ignore that, through the excise taxes on firearms, ammunition, archery equipment, there's about $1 billion to $1.2 billion every single year going back to state-based conservation. Same thing on the fishing side with fishing tackle purchases, right? What other user group is contributing in the way that sportsmen and women are? The answer is not.
The fact that it's self-imposed. We self-imposed that Pittman-Robertson Act that pulls a tax right off the top that goes directly into conservation.
Yep, that's exactly right. And, not only is it self-imposed, but we pride ourselves in it, right? This is something, when I'm sure it's the same as you, Chris, when I'm talking to, friends and family that don't hunt or fish, and I say, hey, here's what this means for conservation. Here's what it means for conserving these species. It's, $1 billion just from the hunting and shooting side that's going to conservation. And they're pretty blown away by that statistic, right? And I say, talk about other user groups, right? Non-consumptive user groups, for lack of a better term, they are not contributing to conservation. It's just sportsmen and women.
Well, I know firsthand, I have quite a few friends that do not hunt. But when I call them up and say, hey, I'm having a game dinner, come on by, they're showing up with a bib and a plate in their hand.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's funny how that works. You invite a buddy out to sit in the deer stand and sit there on a freezing metal ladder. They say no, but man, if there's a back chef or a deer steak, they want it. That's for sure.
Well, I know you got a full schedule today, and you got to continue the fight. I want to thank you so much for coming on and taking the time to keep us informed of the issues at hand. And where can people sign up for the newsletter, Congressional Sportsmen, so they can stay well informed?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. So the simplest way is to visit our website, congressionalsportsmen.org. And on there, you'll see the Sportsman's Voice, which is our weekly newsletter. But we also have a podcast available on all podcast streaming platforms, ranging from Spotify, iTunes, etc. However you get your podcast, known as the Sportsman's Voice. So in that podcast, we do a quick roundup of everything going on around the country. But then we spend time diving into specific issues. So between the Sportsman's Voice newsletter and our Sportsman's Voice podcast, those are really the best ways to stay engaged with CSF, in addition to our social media platforms. But I would say, Chris, thank you very much for doing this podcast on such an important issue. As we talked about, these are the future generations of sportsmen and women, right? And the Archery in Schools program is extremely personal to me in particular, as somebody that had an Archery in Schools program in their high school classroom and loved it, right? So I would say thank you for doing this, and really appreciate your partnership and Dallas Safari Club's partnership on all things related to CSF and hunting, fishing, and our outdoor tradition.
Well, thanks again, and please let us know if there's anything that we could do to help get the word out.
I'll do that. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks again.
Talk soon.